The heavy, old wooden door to my root cellar creaked shut with a satisfying thud, the ancient iron latch dropping into place with a definitive clank. Inside, I could hear a muffled yelp, then a frantic pounding. "Let me out. You can't do this. This is completely out of line." The voice, shrill and utterly panicked, belonged to Deborah, the most notorious busybody in our homeowners association. Just moments before, I had stumbled upon her, red-faced and huffing, amidst my neatly stacked jars of pickles and preserves, a small, dusty flashlight clutched in her trembling hand. Her jaw had dropped when she saw me, her eyes wide with a mix of shock and pure guilt. Mine were wider, filled with a disbelief that slowly morphed into a quiet, steely resolve. I didn't say a word, just stepped back, closed the door, and secured the lock. My fingers fumbled a bit with my phone, but my mind was clear. "Hello, Sheriff's Department?" "Yes, I'd like to report a break-in," I stated calmly, my voice betraying none of the earthquake rumbling inside me. "The intruder is currently detained within my property." "Yes, I'm at, street address." "And yes, I assure you, they are still inside." The dispatcher's voice was a blur of questions, but I answered them steadily, my gaze fixed on the stout wooden door behind which Deborah was now shouting something about property inspections and due diligence. The distant wail of a siren began to grow louder, painting a vivid sound picture of approaching authority. Closer and closer it came, until finally, the unmistakable red and blue lights began to flash through the windows of my house, casting eerie, pulsing shadows across my living room. A patrol car pulled into my driveway, its tires crunching on the gravel, and I heard the solid click of a car door opening. The moment of truth had arrived, but how did it all come to this? To truly understand how we got to this wild moment, where an HOA official found herself locked inside my humble root cellar, we need to go back a little bit in time, to the days when this old house was just a new adventure, and the neighborhood still felt like a peaceful, welcoming dream. My name is Alex, and nearly a year ago, I packed up my entire life from the bustling noise of the big city. I was tired of the constant rush, the endless concrete, and the feeling of being just one tiny cog in a giant, impersonal machine. I longed for something simpler, a place where the air smelled like freshly cut grass instead of exhaust fumes, where the loudest sound was a chirping bird rather than a blaring car horn. That's when I found this house, nestled in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood that promised a slower pace and a connection to something real. It wasn't a fancy house, not by a long shot. It was an old two-story, painted a cheerful butter yellow with white trim, and it had a slightly crooked porch that practically begged for a rocking chair and a tall glass of lemonade. The backyard was huge, sprawling out behind the house like a secret garden, overgrown with wild roses and ancient oak trees. It felt lived in, cozy, and full of stories just waiting to be discovered. Moving in was a whirlwind of cardboard boxes and dusty furniture, but every single moment felt like a step toward a brighter, more peaceful future. I spent the first few weeks just exploring, marveling at the nooks and crannies, the original hardwood floors that creaked in all the right places, and the way the morning sun poured into the kitchen. It was my sanctuary, a place where I could finally breathe. The neighbors were, for the most part, wonderfully kind. Mrs. Henderson from across the street brought over a freshly baked apple pie, still warm from her oven, on my very first day. Mr. Rodriguez, who lived next door, offered to help me carry some of the heavier boxes. There was a real sense of community, of people looking out for one another, and it filled my heart with a quiet joy. This was exactly what I had been searching for. Then came Deborah. My first encounter with her was a week after I moved in. She introduced herself as Deborah Finch, the head of the neighborhood's homeowners association. She was a woman of precise movements and even more precise opinions. Her hair was always perfectly coiffed, her clothes impeccably neat, and she carried a small, leather-bound notebook wherever she went. She smiled a lot, but it was a tight smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She explained the simple rules of the HOA, which included things like keeping lawns mowed, trash cans out of sight, and not painting your house purple without prior approval. I listened patiently, nodding, and thanked her for the information. At the time, she seemed merely diligent, perhaps a bit overly enthusiastic about neighborhood aesthetics. I certainly didn't foresee her becoming the central figure in a dramatic standoff involving law enforcement and my humble root cellar. Little did I know that her simple rules would soon morph into an intricate web of control, threatening the very peace I had sought. One sunny afternoon, while pulling weeds from the very back of the yard, my shovel struck something hard. I thought it was just a buried rock, but as I cleared away more of the overgrown bushes and tangled vines, I uncovered a low, stone wall, almost hidden beneath decades of neglect. My curiosity piqued, I dug further, revealing a small, stout wooden door, its hinges rusted solid, blending almost perfectly with the earth around it. It was a root cellar, an old-fashioned food storage space, common in houses built in the early 1900s, meant to keep vegetables and fruits cool and fresh without refrigeration. I felt a thrill of discovery, like an archaeologist unearthing a lost treasure. The thought of having my own root cellar, a place to store fresh produce from a garden I planned to grow, filled me with an unexpected surge of excitement. It was more than just a storage space, it was a link to the past, a symbol of self-sufficiency, and a way to connect with the rhythm of the seasons. I imagined jars of homegrown tomatoes lining the shelves, crisp apples piled high, and root vegetables waiting patiently for winter stews. It felt wholesome and real, a true contrast to the processed, packaged world I had left behind. I spent hours online, researching how to properly restore a root cellar, poring over diagrams and articles about humidity and temperature control. I envisioned a little haven of fresh food, maybe even enough to share with Mrs. Henderson or Mr. Rodriguez, a small act of kindness in a world that often felt too rushed for such things. It was a simple dream, but it was my dream, and it felt truly inspiring. The first step was to clear away all the overgrowth around the entrance. Armed with gardening shears, a rake, and a shovel, I set to work. It was tough going, especially with the thick brambles and stubborn roots that had taken hold over the years. Sweat beaded on my forehead, and my muscles ached, but the satisfaction of revealing more of the sturdy stone structure fueled my efforts. Each cleared vine felt like a small victory, bringing me closer to my goal. The air was filled with the scent of damp earth and crushed leaves, a refreshing change from the city air I was used to. It was during one of these clearing sessions, about 2 weeks into the project, that Deborah Finch made her first official visit to my backyard. I was kneeling, prying a particularly stubborn root from between 2 stones, when her perfectly polished shoes appeared at the edge of my peripheral vision. "Good afternoon, Alex," her voice was smooth, almost too smooth, like a polished river stone. I looked up, wiping dirt from my brow. She stood there, hands clasped neatly in front of her, a polite but inquisitive expression on her face. Her eyes, however, seemed to dart around, taking in every detail of my work. "Oh, hi Deborah," I replied, a little surprised to see her in my backyard without an invitation. "Just tackling some of this jungle back here." She nodded slowly, her gaze fixed on the exposed entrance of the root cellar. "Indeed. It does seem like quite the undertaking. What exactly are you doing?" The last word was stretched out, a hint of suspicion woven into her tone. I smiled, eager to share my exciting discovery. "I found an old root cellar back here. Isn't that neat? I'm clearing it out, cleaning it up, and planning to use it for food storage. You know, fresh vegetables, preserves, that sort of thing. It'll be wonderful." I gestured enthusiastically at the small, dark opening. Her smile remained fixed, but her eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. "A root cellar, you say?" she repeated, as if tasting the words, deciding whether they were palatable. I wasn't aware this property had such a feature. She then took a step closer, peering down into the entrance. "And this is an original part of the structure, you believe?" Definitely, I confirmed, the way it's built into the stone, the old door, it's clearly been here for ages, just forgotten under all the brush. Deborah hummed, a low, thoughtful sound that sent a tiny shiver down my spine. Well, Alex, I appreciate you informing me. However, any exterior modifications or new structures, even historical ones, typically require prior approval from the homeowners association. Her gaze swept across the cleared area, then back to the root cellar opening. Our guidelines, as you know, are in place to maintain the aesthetic harmony and property values of our community. I blinked, a little taken aback. But it's not a modification, Deborah, it's a restoration. It's an existing feature of the house, just neglected. I'm just making it usable again. She offered another tight smile. A nuanced distinction, perhaps. Nevertheless, our rules are quite clear on anything that alters the external appearance of the property. For instance, any new entryway or visible structure must be reviewed. While I understand your enthusiasm, we must ensure consistency. Could you perhaps provide me with some plans? Or better yet, simply halt work until the board has had a chance to review this development. My heart sank a little. The joy I had felt just moments ago began to drain away, replaced by a dull ache of frustration. This wasn't about property values or aesthetics, it felt like control. Plans? I asked, bewildered. For an old hole in the ground? Just a simple diagram, she insisted, her voice firm. And perhaps some historical documentation, if you have it. We just need to ensure it complies. We wouldn't want any surprises for your neighbors, now, would we? She gestured vaguely towards the perfectly manicured lawns of the surrounding houses. It's all about maintaining our high standards. I bit back a sigh. I understand, Deborah. I'll see what I can put together. I tried to keep my voice even, but a slight tremor betrayed my growing irritation. She nodded, her expression unchanging, then turned and walked away, her departure as precise and deliberate as her arrival. I watched her go, a strange chill settling over me despite the warm afternoon sun. The air suddenly felt heavy, and the simple joy of my root cellar project seemed to have been tainted. This was the first hint that Deborah Finch, and by extension the HOA, would not be as benign as I had hoped. The dream of my tranquil sanctuary suddenly felt vulnerable, exposed to the scrutiny of rigid rules and unspoken expectations. I knew then, with a growing sense of unease, that this was just the beginning of our unusual dance. A few days later, a stiff, formal-looking envelope with the HOA's logo arrived in my mailbox. Inside was a letter, equally stiff and formal, reiterating Deborah's points about unapproved exterior modifications and requesting detailed plans and a projected timeline for the root cellar's restoration. It even cited a specific section of the HOA bylaws that, upon reading, felt like it had been stretched and twisted to fit my situation. It was a low point, a clear signal that this wasn't just a friendly neighborly chat. This was an official challenge to my quiet pursuit of a simple, wholesome life. But something in me, something that had grown weary of always yielding to the demands of others, decided to push back. This wasn't just about a root cellar anymore, it was about my right to enjoy my home, to pursue a harmless passion, and to live authentically. I spent the next few evenings poring over local historical records, digging deep into the archives of the previous owners, and consulting with a local historical society. And I found it, old property deeds, sketches of the original house, and even a small, faded photograph from the 1930s that clearly showed the root cellar entrance, albeit overgrown even then. It was undeniable proof that the root cellar was not a new modification, but an integral, albeit forgotten, part of the property. Armed with this evidence, and a polite but firm letter explaining my findings, I sent a detailed response back to the HOA, copying Deborah, outlining the historical context and my intentions. I emphasized that I was not altering the property but merely restoring a historical feature to its original, intended use, a fact which, I argued, actually added to the property's unique value and charm. I waited, a quiet tension building inside me, wondering if my calm stand would be enough to deter their relentless pursuit of conformity. The work on the root cellar continued, albeit with a growing sense of unease. The tension with Deborah was no longer just a faint hum, it was a distinct, simmering presence, a cloud threatening to break the peaceful sky I had envisioned for my new home. I had taken my stand, but the feeling that this was far from over lingered, a premonition of the extreme events yet to unfold. The days that followed my letter to the HOA were oddly quiet. It was the kind of quiet that feels less like peace and more like the calm before a big storm. I kept working on the root cellar, slowly, carefully, cleaning out the dirt and debris, shoring up the old stone walls, and dreaming of the day it would be filled with the bounty of my garden. I planted a small patch of tomatoes and herbs, a humble start, but one that filled me with hope. The sun shone, the birds sang, and life in my little yellow house seemed to settle into a comfortable rhythm. Mrs. Henderson brought over more of her amazing cookies, and Mr. Rodriguez offered tips on growing the best peppers. It felt like the community I had always wanted, a place where people helped each other and shared simple joys. Yet, every time I saw Deborah's perfectly coiffed head pass by my house, or spotted her precise figure walking her tiny poodle down the street, a little knot of anxiety tightened in my stomach. Her usual tight smile seemed a little tighter, her gaze a little longer, whenever our paths crossed. It was clear she hadn't forgotten about the root cellar. It was like she was constantly watching, waiting for me to slip up, or for some opportunity to reassert her authority. I knew my historical proof was solid, but Deborah wasn't someone who seemed to back down easily. Her need for control felt almost like a force of nature, always pushing, always testing boundaries. I tried to focus on the good things, the simple pleasures of my home and garden, but the quiet tension was always there, a low hum beneath the surface of my peaceful life. Then came the next, official, correspondence from the HOA, not a letter this time, but a formal notice slipped under my door late one afternoon. This one wasn't about the root cellar directly. Instead, it was a complaint about my front yard. It stated, in very particular legal-sounding words, that my unmanicured lawn and excessive flower beds were in violation of Article 7, Section C, Subsection 2, Landscape Aesthetics. I looked out at my lawn, which I had just mowed 2 days prior, and my flower beds, which were bursting with colorful petunias and marigolds. They were vibrant, lively, and, in my opinion, beautiful. It felt like Deborah was grasping at straws, trying to find anything she could to exert her power. I sighed, pinching the bridge of my nose. This was a classic low, a petty nuisance meant to wear me down. I considered ignoring it, but I knew that would only make things worse. Instead, I took pictures of my yard, showing its neatness and the healthy, well-tended flowers. I even measured the grass height, just to be extra sure. My response was polite but firm, explaining how my landscaping actually enhanced the neighborhood's beauty and met all reasonable standards. I attached the photos, along with a copy of my water bill to show I wasn't wasting water on a wild, out-of-control lawn. I felt like I was arguing with a robot, a system designed to find faults rather than appreciate effort. This petty back and forth continued for weeks. Every time I thought I had dealt with one issue, another would pop up. A complaint about my trash cans being visible from the street on Tuesdays, even though I put them out at 6 a.m. on pickup day. A passive-aggressive note about a single fallen leaf on my driveway. It was autumn, leaves were everywhere. It was exhausting, a constant drain on my energy and patience. I found myself looking over my shoulder, checking every little detail of my property, just waiting for the next ridiculous complaint. It began to feel less about rules and more about a personal vendetta from Deborah, as if she was trying to make my life miserable until I either gave up on the root cellar or moved away. It chipped away at my peace, leaving me feeling constantly on edge. The gentle hum of anxiety was now a loud, buzzing annoyance. One particularly warm Saturday, I decided to take a break from the constant HOA battles and focus on something positive. I had finished clearing out the root cellar and was ready to start some light repairs on the interior. The air inside was cool and damp, a refreshing escape from the summer heat. I brought in a small fan to help with air circulation and some special sealant to protect the ancient stone. As I worked, the sound of my favorite music played softly from a portable speaker. It was a meditative process, brushing away centuries of dust, feeling the cool, rough texture of the stones, imagining all the meals that had been stored there long ago. It felt good, honest work, far removed from the absurdities of HOA rules and regulations. I was deep inside the cellar, humming along to a song, when I heard it, a distinct thump-thump from above ground, followed by a faint scratching sound. My heart gave a little jump. It sounded like someone was very close to the root cellar entrance, perhaps even on the little hillock where the wooden door sat. I paused, holding my breath, listening intently. Was it just a squirrel? Or perhaps Mr. Rodriguez's cat, Mittens, exploring? I hoped it was nothing, but the recent history with Deborah had made me hyper-aware of every unusual sound. The scratching continued, more deliberate this time, almost like something being dragged across rough ground. It was too heavy for a squirrel, too rhythmic for a cat. A cold dread began to creep into my stomach. I slowly, carefully, moved towards the root cellar opening, pushing aside a few empty storage crates to get a better view. The small entrance was still dark, but a sliver of light from above filtered in, showing dust motes dancing in the air. The sounds grew louder, clearer now. It wasn't just scratching, it was a distinctive clink sound, like metal on metal, followed by a heavy groan as if something was being pried open. My mind raced. Could someone be trying to steal my gardening tools? Or perhaps they were trying to break into the main house through the cellar, though that seemed highly unlikely. The more likely, and far more unsettling, thought was that Deborah was somehow involved. But what could she possibly be doing? My pulse quickened. I peered up through the narrow opening, my eyes straining to make out any shapes in the dim light. I could hear muffled grunts now, accompanied by more of the prying sounds. Someone was definitely trying to get into my root cellar, and they were putting a lot of effort into it. Fear, sharp and cold, shot through me, quickly followed by a rush of angry indignation. This was my property, my sanctuary. Who would dare? Just as I was about to call out, to demand to know who was there, the sounds abruptly stopped. A sudden silence descended, thick and heavy, broken only by my own ragged breathing. Then, a low, triumphant chuckle, unmistakably female. It sent shivers down my spine. I stayed perfectly still, hidden in the shadows, waiting. My heart pounded against my ribs like a trapped bird. I heard a soft click, then the gentle creak of the old wooden door opening. A beam of bright sunlight suddenly pierced the darkness, illuminating the dusty interior of the root cellar. A shadow fell across the opening, then a figure began to slowly descend the short, stone steps. My eyes widened in disbelief, then narrowed in fury, as I recognized the familiar, perfectly coiffed head of Deborah Finch. She was holding a large, industrial-looking flashlight, its beam sweeping across the interior of my root cellar as she took her first step onto the dirt floor. My mouth fell open. What was she doing? And how did she get the lock open? This was no petty complaint about lawn height, this was an egregious invasion, a blatant act of trespass. The air crackled with unspoken confrontation, and I knew, with chilling certainty, that the quiet storm had finally broken, bringing with it a shock that would shake this peaceful neighborhood to its core. Deborah took another step into my root cellar, her flashlight beam dancing across the earthen floor and the neatly stacked, empty shelves. She hummed a little tune, a self-satisfied sound that grated on my ears. I stayed hidden, pressed against the cool stone wall behind a stack of empty canning jars, hardly daring to breathe. My mind was racing, trying to figure out how she had managed to open the heavy, sturdy lock I had put on the outside. Had she picked it? Or did she have a key? The thought made my blood run cold. This was more than just a nosy neighbor, this was a deliberate, planned invasion. She moved slowly, meticulously, her eyes scanning every corner. She ran her hand along a stone wall, then stooped to examine the small fan I had brought in for ventilation. A bit damp in here, isn't it?" she muttered to herself, her voice echoing strangely in the enclosed space. She wasn't just curious, she was inspecting, judging, almost as if she owned the place. It was infuriating. I wanted to jump out and confront her, to demand an explanation, but something held me back. A part of me wanted to see how far she would go, to truly understand the depth of her audacity. The other part was simply frozen in disbelief and a cold, simmering rage. Deborah then pulled out her small, leather-bound notebook and a tiny pen from her purse. She clicked the pen, and began to scribble, her flashlight beam directed at the page. What was she writing down? Complaints about the humidity? Notes about my unapproved ventilation system? It felt utterly absurd, yet terrifyingly real. She was documenting her trespass, treating it like an official HOA inspection, as if my private property was just another item on her checklist. My hands clenched into fists at my sides, my knuckles white. After a few more moments of silent, meticulous inspection, Deborah finally turned towards the root cellar door. My heart pounded. Was she leaving? Would she just walk out, oblivious to my presence, leaving me with this bizarre, infuriating secret? She took a step, then another, towards the opening. I held my breath, preparing myself to stay hidden until she was gone. But then, just as she reached the bottom of the stone steps, she stopped. Her head tilted slightly, as if she had heard something. Or perhaps, as if she suddenly felt a presence. My stomach dropped. Had I made a sound? Her flashlight beam swung wildly for a moment, then settled directly on the stack of empty canning jars where I was hiding. My blood ran cold. She hadn't seen me, not really, but she was looking right at my hiding spot. Her eyes narrowed, a flicker of something unreadable passing through them. She took a tentative step closer, her silhouette growing larger in the beam of light. I could almost feel her gaze piercing through the dusty glass jars. "Hello?" She called out, her voice suddenly sharper, less self-assured. "Is anyone there?" My heart leaped into my throat. This was it. The moment of confrontation. I took a deep breath, ready to burst out and unleash all my pent-up frustration. But then, before I could move, a faint, almost imperceptible sound came from outside the root cellar. A small, distant ping. Deborah froze. Her head snapped back towards the open door, her flashlight beam following her gaze. She seemed momentarily distracted, her focus shifting from my hiding place to whatever small noise had just occurred outside. I seized the opportunity, quickly and quietly. I moved from behind the jars, slipping further into the deepest, darkest corner of the cellar, hoping she hadn't truly seen me. Deborah stood still for another moment, listening. The ping wasn't repeated. She shrugged, a tiny, dismissive gesture, and then, to my surprise, she didn't leave. Instead, she took a few more steps, not towards the exit, but towards the far wall of the root cellar, where I had recently started to build some new, sturdy wooden shelves. "These look rather new," she murmured, tapping one of the freshly cut planks. "Certainly not original." She pulled out her pen and notebook again, beginning to write. My jaw clenched. The audacity. She wasn't just trespassing, she was meticulously inventorying my private property, making notes for future complaints. That was the moment I snapped. The previous months of petty complaints, the constant scrutiny, the feeling of being watched, all culminated in a sudden, cold fury. This wasn't just about a root cellar or even about HOA rules. This was about a complete lack of respect, an invasion of privacy, and a blatant disregard for personal boundaries. She had crossed a line, a very clear, bold line. And now, she was trapped in the very space she had violated. Without another thought, I moved. I didn't shout, I didn't announce myself. I simply moved with a quiet, determined purpose. I emerged from the shadows, making my way silently towards the opening of the root cellar. Deborah was still hunched over her notebook, oblivious to my presence, scribbling away. I reached the bottom of the steps. The sunlight felt warm on my face, but my heart was cold. I quickly climbed the steps, my movements smooth and swift, pulling myself out of the root cellar. The fresh air hit me, a stark contrast to the damp, musty air below. I stood there for a split second, looking down at Deborah, who was still engrossed in her notes. She looked small and vulnerable down in the damp earth, utterly unaware of the trap she had walked into. I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and disbelief. This was truly happening. I reached for the heavy, old wooden door. It was surprisingly light in my hand as I pulled it towards me. With a soft click, it swung shut, plunging Deborah back into near darkness, save for the narrow beam of her flashlight. The silence from inside was immediate and absolute. Then, a shocked gasp. What was that? Deborah's voice, muffled but clearly panicked, echoed from within. I didn't answer. I reached for the thick iron latch, the same one she must have somehow picked or bypassed to get in. It dropped into place with a definitive clank, the sound resonating through the quiet afternoon. Then, I pulled the heavy pad bolt I had installed just days before, sliding it through the eye hole and securing it with the stout padlock I always kept nearby. The lock clicked shut with a final, echoing snap. A moment later, the muffled screams began. Let me out. Who's there? This isn't funny. Alex, is that you? Let me out of here right now. Her voice grew shriller, laced with a growing hysteria. She pounded on the door, a frantic, rhythmic thumping that vibrated through the ground. I stood there, my breathing finally steadying. I pulled out my phone, my fingers surprisingly calm as I dialed the sheriff's department. Hello, sheriff's department? Yes, I'd like to report a break-in, I stated, my voice clear and firm. The intruder is currently detained within my property. Yes, I'm at, street address. And yes, I assure you, they are still inside. The dispatcher's voice was a blur of questions, but I answered them steadily, my gaze fixed on the stout wooden door behind which Deborah was now shouting something about property inspections and due diligence. The distant wail of a siren began to grow louder, painting a vivid sound picture of approaching authority. Closer and closer it came, until finally, the unmistakable red and blue lights began to flash through the windows of my house, casting eerie, pulsing shadows across my living room. A patrol car pulled into my driveway, its tires crunching on the gravel, and I heard the solid click of a car door opening. The sounds of Deborah's frantic shouts were now muffled by the approaching sirens, a bizarre symphony of panic and imminent justice. I stood by the root cellar door, waiting. The sheriff was here. What would they do? And what would Deborah say? The truth of what she had done, and the sheer audacity of it, was about to be laid bare. The patrol car doors clicked shut, and I heard the steady footsteps on my gravel driveway. Two sheriff's deputies, a tall man named Deputy Miller and a shorter woman, Deputy Chavez, walked towards me. Their faces were calm, professional, but their eyes held a hint of curiosity as they took in the scene, me standing calmly by a locked root cellar door, and the faint, muffled sounds of a very upset person yelling from inside the ground. Good afternoon, ma'am, Deputy Miller began, his voice deep and even. You called about a break-in? I nodded, gesturing towards the heavy wooden door. Yes, Deputy. The intruder is in there. Her name is Deborah Finch, and she's the head of our HOA. Deputy Chavez raised an eyebrow, a small flicker of surprise crossing her face. The HOA president? Are you certain? Absolutely certain, I replied, my voice steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through me. I found her inside my root cellar, which is a part of my private property. She had no permission to be here, let alone to enter. A loud, frustrated thump came from inside the cellar, followed by Deborah's shrill voice, slightly clearer now that the sirens were off. "Let me out of here. This is a misunderstanding. I was merely conducting a routine inspection." Deputy Miller exchanged a quick glance with Deputy Chavez. "A routine inspection of a root cellar?" he asked, a hint of skepticism in his tone. He then addressed the door. "Ma'am, this is the sheriff's department. Please calm down. We're going to get this sorted out." Deborah's response was a fresh wave of indignant shouts, none of which made much sense through the thick wood. Deputy Chavez knelt down, putting her ear close to the door. She stood back up, shaking her head slightly. "She sounds quite agitated." "She broke in," I reiterated, my gaze firm. "I don't know how she got the lock open, but I secured it when I realized she was inside. This isn't just about HOA rules, it's about trespassing on private property." Deputy Miller walked over to the door, examining the padlock and the sturdy iron latch. He then pulled out his radio and spoke into it quietly, relaying the situation to dispatch. While he did that, Deputy Chavez turned to me. "Can you explain exactly what happened leading up to this, ma'am?" I took a deep breath and recounted the story, starting from my discovery of the root cellar, my plans for restoration, Deborah's initial visit and the subsequent complaints, and finally, finding her inside my cellar, notebook in hand. I explained how the constant harassment, the petty complaints about my lawn and leaves, had created a pattern of invasion that culminated in this egregious act. I tried to keep my voice calm and factual, but the underlying frustration and feeling of violation were clear in my tone. The deputies listened patiently, nodding occasionally. Deputy Miller finished his radio call and joined us. "So, you're saying she's been trying to interfere with your property for some time, and this root cellar was a particular point of contention?" "Yes," I confirmed. I provided historical documentation proving it's an original part of the house, but she seemed determined to find fault with it, or with anything else she could. This felt like a direct escalation. Another furious thump came from inside the cellar, making the door rattle. "Officer! I have a right to be here. I'm acting on behalf of the association." Deborah shrieked. Deputy Miller looked at the door, then back at me. "Ma'am, does the HOA have any standing right to enter private structures on your property without your explicit permission or a court order?" "Not to my knowledge," I replied. "And certainly not a root cellar. There's nothing in their bylaws that permits such an invasion of privacy." The deputies exchanged another look. It was clear they had dealt with HOA disputes before, but perhaps never one quite like this. "All right," Deputy Miller said, taking a step closer to the door. He tried to speak through the wood in a calm, authoritative voice. "Ms. Finch, we need you to cooperate. We're going to open this door, but we need you to step out calmly so we can understand the situation fully." Deborah's response was a mix of demands and threats, still largely muffled. Deputy Chavez approached the door, and with a careful, precise movement, she released the padlock and slid back the bolt. The iron latch clanked open. The heavy wooden door swung inward with a groan, revealing Deborah blinking in the sudden rush of afternoon light. Her face was flushed, her hair was slightly disheveled, and her perfectly neat clothes were now streaked with a bit of dirt from the root cellar floor. She looked utterly furious, like a wild animal cornered. Finally, she shrieked, scrambling out of the cellar and almost tripping on the last step. "This is an outrage. You, Alex. You had no right to lock me in here. I was merely performing my duties as HOA president. You are interfering with association business, and I will see you sued for unlawful detention." She pointed a trembling finger at me, her eyes blazing. "You broke into my house, Deborah," I said calmly, my voice contrasting sharply with her outburst. You trespassed on my private property. I have every right to protect my home. Deputy Miller stepped between us, his presence a calm barrier. A mess. Finch, we understand you believe you were performing your duties. However, you cannot enter private property without permission. Can you explain why you were inside this resident's root cellar? Deborah puffed herself up, trying to regain her composure, but her voice still wavered with indignation. I received anonymous complaints about unapproved structures and potential code violations regarding this hole in the ground, she declared, gesturing dismissively at the root cellar. It's an eyesore, a hazard. My duty is to protect property values and ensure compliance with HOA bylaws. I was simply gathering information. And you believed entering a locked structure on private property without permission was the appropriate way to gather information? Deputy Chavez asked, her tone dry. Well, it's difficult to assess the situation from the outside, isn't it? Deborah retorted, her voice rising again. And this resident has been uncooperative regarding previous inquiries about this structure. I have a duty to the community. Do you have a warrant, Ms. Finch, to enter this property? Deputy Miller inquired, his voice now a little sharper. Or a court order? Or even written permission from the homeowner? Deborah spluttered, her face turning an even deeper shade of red. I don't need a warrant to ensure our community standards are upheld. This is HOA business. No, ma'am, that's not how it works, Deputy Miller stated firmly. Entering a locked structure on private property without permission or a legal order is trespassing. It can also be considered breaking and entering, depending on how you gained access. He then turned to me. Ma'am, how did she get in? Was the lock broken? I shook my head. The lock is fine. It was locked when I found her inside. I don't know how she opened it. Deborah, hearing this, suddenly looked panicked. I simply found it ajar. It was slightly open. I merely pushed it further to investigate a potential hazard. Her eyes darted around nervously, avoiding the deputy's gaze. Deputy Chavez walked over to the door and carefully examined the padlock and the latch. She then turned back, her expression unreadable. The lock appears intact, Ms. Finch. And the bolt was clearly engaged. It seems unlikely it was ajar if it was properly secured. A tense silence hung in the air. Deborah's triumphant bluster had evaporated, replaced by a desperate, trapped look. The deputies were clearly not convinced by her story. The consequences of her actions were beginning to dawn on her, stark and chilling. The comfortable illusion of HOA authority, which she had wielded like a weapon, was suddenly crumbling under the stern gaze of actual law enforcement. The simple peace I had sought in my new home was now shattered, replaced by the grim reality of legal confrontation. I stood there, watching her, a quiet understanding dawning on me. This wasn't just a battle over a root cellar, it was a battle for my peace, my privacy, and my right to live unmolested in my own home. And it felt like we were just getting started. Deputy Miller's voice was firm, cutting through the tense silence. A mess. Finch, you're going to need to provide a very clear explanation as to why you were inside a locked structure on private property, especially when the owner states they found it locked and secured before you entered. Your claim of finding it ajar simply doesn't hold up if the lock is intact and was engaged. He pointed a finger towards the open root cellar door, then to the sturdy padlock lying on the ground next to the entrance. Deborah swallowed hard, her eyes darting between my calm face and the unyielding expressions of the two deputies. The color drained from her face, replaced by a pasty, greenish hue. The air, which had been thick with her bluster, suddenly felt heavy with her fear. She looked like a cornered rat, her previous air of self-importance completely gone. I. She stammered, fumbling for words. It's a misunderstanding. I saw some overgrown weeds near the entrance, and I was just trying to to get a better look at what she was doing down there. For the neighborhood's benefit. She wrung her hands, her gaze fixed on the ground. It was a pathetic attempt at an excuse, and it was clear to everyone present that she was lying. "Ms. Finch," Deputy Chavez interjected, her voice gentle but firm. "We've heard the homeowner's account, and it sounds like this has been an ongoing issue. We're here to enforce the law, not HOA bylaws. Trespassing is against the law. Breaking and entering is a serious offense." She paused, letting her words sink in. "We need to know how you got in." Deborah's shoulders slumped. She looked utterly defeated, all her carefully constructed facade of authority crumbling around her. She closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them, revealing a flicker of something close to despair. "There's a spare key," she whispered, her voice barely audible. My jaw dropped. A spare key? To my root cellar? This was a new level of audacity, one I hadn't even considered. The root cellar was old, sure, but I had specifically fitted it with a new, sturdy padlock when I started restoring it. The original, rusted lock had been useless. Deputy Miller leaned in, his brow furrowed. "A spare key, Miss Finch? A key to this particular lock?" He gestured towards the padlock. "Where would you have gotten a key to a new lock installed by the current homeowner?" Deborah hesitated, clearly trying to weigh her options, trying to find a way out of the corner she had backed herself into. But there was no escape. She was caught, red-handed, with no plausible explanation. I found it," she mumbled, her eyes still on the ground. "When the previous owner moved out, they left a box of old keys for the new owners, for miscellaneous sheds and outbuildings. I, as HOA president, helped facilitate the handover of some documents and general property information. I thought it might be a spare for something on this property." Her voice trailed off, her explanation sounding weaker with every word. She was clearly trying to paint it as an honest mistake, a simple act of finding an old key. But her previous actions, the calculated trespass, the detailed notes she had been taking, spoke volumes louder than her fabricated innocence. And I knew for a fact that the previous owner, a sweet elderly lady named Mrs. Peterson, had only left me one set of house keys, along with a clearly labeled key for the garden shed, which was nowhere near the root cellar. There was no box of old keys that she would have given to Deborah. "Ms. Finch," Deputy Chavez said, her voice now devoid of any softness. "Are you implying you deliberately withheld a key to this property from the new homeowner? Or that you somehow came into possession of a key that grants you access to this residence?" Deborah flinched. "No. Not deliberately. It was just an oversight. I just held on to it, in case something came up for the HOA to address. I had no idea it was for this new lock. I just thought it was for an old lock." She was sweating now, beads of perspiration forming on her upper lip despite the mild afternoon. Her perfectly coiffed hair looked a little less perfect. Deputy Miller held up the padlock. "Ms. Finch, this is a relatively new, standard residential padlock. Keys for these are not generally found in old boxes of miscellaneous keys unless specifically given to someone. Did you perhaps try this key on the lock previously?" Her eyes widened in horror, realizing her story was unraveling completely. She clearly hadn't thought her lie through. A new, specific padlock would not have been opened by an old, random key. Her desperate attempt to spin a tale of innocent discovery was crashing down around her. She looked utterly defeated, unable to meet anyone's gaze. The silence stretched, filled only by the chirping of crickets and the distant murmur of traffic. Finally, she whispered, her voice barely audible, "No. I had a locksmith rekey it. For community safety. Just in case." My eyes widened in shock. A locksmith? She had gone to a locksmith, presumably with an old key or a blank, and had the lock rekeyed without my knowledge or permission, then used that key to break in. This wasn't a misunderstanding, this was a calculated, deliberate invasion of privacy and property. This was no longer just about an HOA dispute, it was a serious criminal act, a violation of trust and an outright abuse of power. The sheer audacity of her actions took my breath away. It was a level of extreme behavior I hadn't imagined possible, even from Deborah. Deputy Miller and Deputy Chavez exchanged a long, serious look. This changed everything. This wasn't a simple trespass anymore. This was a premeditated act, a shocking escalation of a petty feud into a blatant violation of the law. Deputy Miller pulled out a small notepad and pen. "Ms. Finch," he said, his voice now entirely devoid of any patience or understanding. "Did you, or did you not, obtain a key for this specific lock without the homeowner's knowledge or consent, and then use it to enter their private property?" Deborah stared at him, her lips trembling. She tried to speak, but no words came out. Her face was ashen, her eyes wide with a dawning terror. She looked from Deputy Miller to Deputy Chavez, then to me, a desperate plea for mercy in her eyes. But there was no mercy left for her, not after such a blatant and insidious act. This was the moment of truth, the moment her reign of petty tyranny met the harsh reality of the law. The peaceful afternoon had turned into a courtroom of consequences, and Deborah Finch was on trial for her own outrageous behavior. Deputy Miller's pen hovered over his notepad, his gaze fixed on Deborah. "Ms. Finch, we need an answer. Did you obtain a key for this specific lock without the homeowner's knowledge or consent and then use it to enter their private property?" His voice was low, but it carried an undeniable weight of authority that crushed Deborah's last vestiges of defiance. She whimpered, a small, pathetic sound, and nodded almost imperceptibly. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "I did. I had a locksmith make a key based on the old one I found." Deputy Chavez knelt down and examined the padlock once more, then stood up, her face grim. "So, you took a key that belonged to the previous owner, for a presumably old lock, and had a new key made for the new lock that Alex installed?" Deborah nodded again, unable to meet our eyes. I thought it was important for the HOA to have access in case of an emergency. For safety reasons. And Alex was being uncooperative about the root cellar. She desperately clung to her flimsy excuses, even as they crumbled around her. "Ms. Finch," Deputy Miller said, his voice now flat, "obtaining a key to someone's private property without their permission and then using it to enter that property is a criminal act. That's not HOA business, that's breaking and entering." He paused, letting the words sink in. "And potentially unlawful surveillance if you were making notes on what you found inside." Deborah looked like she might faint. Her legs seemed to give out, and she stumbled, catching herself on the frame of the root cellar door. The stark reality of her actions, and the serious legal consequences, were finally hitting her with full force. She wasn't just a bossy HOA president anymore, she was a suspect in a criminal investigation. Deputy Miller continued, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. "Deborah Finch, you are under arrest for breaking and entering and trespassing. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you." The click of the handcuffs was shockingly loud in the quiet afternoon air. Deborah gasped, her eyes wide with terror, not anger. "Arrest? You can't arrest me. I'm the HOA president. This is ridiculous. I'll call my lawyer. I'll call the mayor." Her voice rose to a panicked shriek as Deputy Miller gently but firmly took her arm and began to place the cuffs on her wrists. "Ma'am, please cooperate," Deputy Chavez said, stepping forward to assist. As the handcuffs clicked shut, Deborah let out a loud, wailing sob. "This is all your fault, Alex," she shrieked, twisting her head to glare at me, her eyes filled with a raw, desperate hatred. You brought this upon yourself. You and your stupid root cellar. I simply stood there, watching, a strange mix of relief and sadness washing over me. Relief that her reign of terror was finally ending, but sadness that it had come to this, that kindness and understanding had been so completely rejected in favor of control and suspicion. Deputy Miller led a distraught Deborah towards the patrol car, her cries echoing across the peaceful neighborhood. Mr. Rodriguez and Mrs. Henderson, alerted by the commotion, had cautiously emerged from their houses and were watching the scene unfold with wide, stunned eyes. They looked at me, then at Deborah being led away, their faces a mixture of confusion and dawning comprehension. Deputy Chavez stayed behind for a moment, making sure the root cellar was secure. She then turned to me. "Alex, we'll need you to come down to the station to give a formal statement. This is a serious charge." "Of course, Deputy," I replied, my voice a little shaky now that the adrenaline was fading. Later that evening, after giving my statement at the sheriff's station, I returned home. The neighborhood was quiet, almost eerily so. The news of Deborah Finch's arrest spread like wildfire. The next few days were a blur of phone calls from shocked neighbors, some expressing disbelief, others quietly admitting they weren't surprised, recounting their own experiences with Deborah's overbearing nature. The HOA board, utterly humiliated, swiftly removed Deborah from her position. An emergency meeting was called, and for the first time, neighbors truly spoke up about the toxic environment Deborah had created. Stories emerged of her petty complaints, her intimidating tactics, and her relentless pursuit of control over every minor detail of people's lives. It was like a dam had broken, and a flood of shared experiences poured out, uniting the community against the very person who was supposed to be leading it. The legal process for Deborah was long and complicated. With the evidence of the rekeyed lock, her own admission, and my clear testimony, the case against her was strong. She tried to argue it was an emergency access key for the HOA, but there was no such provision in the bylaws, and her blatant lies to the deputies made her defense crumble. In the end, she faced charges of unlawful entry and was sentenced to community service and a hefty fine, along with a permanent restraining order keeping her away from my property. The judge made it clear that while HOA rules existed, they did not supersede individual property rights and privacy. The wild ending for the neighborhood, however, was just beginning. The incident with Deborah became a turning point. The new HOA president, a kind and reasonable man named David Chen, worked to rebuild trust. He held open forums, listened to residents' concerns, and implemented new, transparent policies. The focus shifted from rigid control to genuine community building. Neighbors started helping each other, sharing ideas for gardens, organizing potlucks, and truly looking out for one another. As for my root cellar, it became a symbol of resilience. I finished the restoration, and it became a cool, dry haven for my homegrown produce. I found myself with a surplus of vegetables from my garden, and remembering my initial dream of sharing, I started a small, community harvest stand at the end of my driveway. Neighbors would stop by, take what they needed, and sometimes leave their own extra produce or a small note of thanks. It was a simple act of kindness, a direct contrast to the selfishness Deborah had embodied. The little yellow house, once a battleground of rules and regulations, finally became the sanctuary I had always envisioned. The quiet hum of anxiety was replaced by the peaceful rhythm of growing things and the gentle laughter of friendly neighbors. Deborah Finch disappeared from our lives, but the lessons she inadvertently taught us about respect, boundaries, and the true meaning of community, blossomed in her absence. The root cellar, a place of conflict, became a foundation for connection, proving that even in the darkest corners, kindness can take root and flourish.